In Stoneburg, Texas, on July 11, 1983, a drifter named Henry Lee Lucas was arrested for the illegal possession of a firearm. As a convicted felon, he wasn't allowed to have one. Lucas was 46 at the time and a suspect in the case of 2 missing women, but thus far, the leads were tenuous. Investigators were relieved to be able to lock him up for even a minor infraction because they figured that once he was in custody, they could get him to talk about the women he'd known. Kate Rich, 82, and Becky Powell, just a girl at 15, had been Lucas's companion. Witnesses had seen him with Kate on the day she disappeared. The one-eyed drifter just looked like bad news waiting to happen. At the very least, he should be able to tell them why Becky was no longer with him. Lucas was not happy about being locked up, especially because it kept him from coffee and cigarettes. He said that he'd been on the verge of helping to find Kate, but now they could do without his assistance. He was placed in a small cell in the Montague County Jail. Lucas claimed later, probably lying, that the police had treated him badly, stripping him, denying him cigarettes, holding him in a substandard cell, and prohibiting his contact with an attorney. He'd endured it for a period of 4 days and then decided to get their attention. While talking with one of the jailers, Joe Don, Lucas admitted that he'd done some bad things. As if to mitigate it, he said that he'd tried and failed to get help. "I've killed for the past 10 years, he confessed, and no one will believe me. Clearly, he was ready to talk, so investigators were positive that they'd soon have the information they needed to wrap up these 2 cases. Indeed, they did, and then some. Lucas's story is told in 2 full-length books, The Confessions of Henry Lee Lucas by Mike Cox and Hands of Death by Max Call, although Call apparently believed everything that Lucas said, which, in light of the details following, makes his book less than credible. Lucas has also been featured in several television documentaries, such as A&E's Myth of a Serial Killer and the 1986 movie Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which was recently released in a 20th anniversary edition. The Road, a 1988 play by David Earl Jones, was also based on stories Lucas told. After admitting that he killed, Lucas was charged with the murders of Kate Rich and Frida Becky Powell. He gave the authorities plenty of evidence, including the decomposed pieces of Becky, and at his June 21st arraignment in the Montague County courtroom, Lucas stated that he'd stabbed Kate Rich to death. But then he went on, waiving his right to an attorney, to say that he'd had sex with the body, cut it into pieces, and burned it in a wood stove behind his cabin. "I killed Kate Rich," he told a courtroom full of curious cops and reporters, and at least 100 more. The reaction was a stunned silence. 100? Either this guy was an out-and-out liar, or he was about to officially become the most proficient serial killer in American history. The judge asked Lucas if he'd ever been diagnosed by a psychiatrist, and he said he hadn't. He was lying, since he'd had several assessments during stints in prison. Yet he added, "I know it ain't normal for a person to go out and kill girls just to have sex with them." In response to the judge's next question, Lucas believed he was competent to stand trial, so he was granted a public defender, Don Maxfield, to represent him. When the judge entered a plea of not guilty for Lucas, the drifter asked, "Will I still be able to go on helping find bodies?" He was urged to discuss it with his attorney. By June 22nd, thanks to a front-page story, Henry Lee Lucas had become a nationally famous serial killer. The Texas Department of Public Safety had plenty of unsolved murder cases on the books, and it appeared that Lucas was good for some of them. The officers began the process by contacting other jurisdictions around the state to facilitate interviews between Lucas and relevant law enforcement officials. Word spread as well to officers in other states with open murder cases, since Lucas had drifted around the country for several years. His descriptions just might fit their Jane Does, so they were granted interviews. In fact, when an officer mentioned to the prisoner where he was from, Lucas would often say, "Oh yeah, I got me some there in your area." Not everyone believed him, and those with doubts sought corroborating evidence, but it often seemed that Lucas, with his prodigious memory, offered details about a murder that had not been printed in the press, so his description seemed credible. He also told them that he knew how not to leave evidence, and in many cases, his confession was the only thing that tied him to a body. That made the requirement for corroboration difficult. Those officers who coordinated the interviews urged all incoming detectives to follow a careful protocol, but ultimately, it was the job of each jurisdiction to decide if they accepted Lucas as the killer they sought. For the court, 3 psychiatrists were appointed to examine Lucas, and although a gag order was imposed, reporters flocked to Texas to try to get whatever they could, if only a quote from a grocery clerk who had served the homely outlaw some coffee. His notoriety blossomed, and several television news shows requested tapes of interviews. Lucas signed statements about specific murders and offered drawings of more than 70 bodies to officers who came or requested information. And he soon had 7 cases cleared, including one that would become famously linked to him. He described a woman he'd killed in 1979 and dumped several years earlier in a culvert off Interstate 35 north of Georgetown, Texas. When found, she wore only a pair of orange socks, so the officers had dubbed her Orange Socks. Lucas not only described her and confessed to killing her in several statements, but also took officers straight to where he dumped her. Over several months, he offered more summaries for murders for which he had not yet been questioned, including a husband and wife in one Texas county who'd owned a liquor store. Sometimes he murdered to rob and then eliminate witnesses. Other times, he just enjoyed the transient feeling of power it gave him. Usually, he'd quickly killed the girls or women he'd picked up because he preferred sexual contact with a corpse, although Stephen Egger, who interviewed him, indicates in serial murder an elusive phenomenon that he was impotent. To me, he said in an interview, "A live woman ain't nothing." Lucas generally used a knife or strangled them, but he was an advocate for trying different methods so as to not leave a pattern that police might link together. He appeared to be quite buoyant about his arrest, according to American justice, and to accept with complacency that he could get the death penalty. It seemed that being in prison suited him just fine, especially because he was treated well and probably had better food and shelter than he was used to. He did all he could to cooperate, and the officers generally found him congenial. Nevertheless, he would prove to be a trickster. Lucas was arraigned for the Orange Socks murder on August 2, 1983, but in a surprise turnaround on August 12th, claimed that he was not guilty of Becky Powell's murder, despite his initial statements. At the end of September, he waived his right to a trial for the murder of Kate Rich and pled guilty, receiving a sentence of 75 years. The following month, his attorney asked the judge to consider throwing out Lucas's written and videotaped statements about his murder of Becky Powell. On the tape, Lucas was shown calmly describing how he'd killed and dismembered her and had sexual contact with the corpse, so the judge decided the material would be admissible. In addition, the option of pleading not guilty by reason of insanity was denied. That left Lucas's defender with few options, but it was Lucas himself who proved to be his own defender's greatest hurdle. Lucas not only went to trial that November, but also testified on his own behalf and seemed to hope to be convicted. His attorney was Tom Whitlock, who argued that Lucas had not intended to kill Becky. On the stand, a tearful Lucas admitted to Becky's murder, but said he didn't know quite how it happened and he was full of remorse over it. Then, after he was convicted and received a life sentence, he congratulated the prosecutor with, "You did a good job." Lucas then issued a statement to the effect that he'd not tried to win because he didn't want to. Previously, he'd bragged to police that he was smart and could get out of anything if he wanted to. His next trial would be for Orange Socks, but this time it would be a capital crime where the death penalty was a possibility. Before that occurred, Lucas got back in touch with an old friend and traveling partner, Ottis Toole. If not for Ottis, he'd never have met Becky. In 1976, after years in prison for various crimes, Lucas had teamed up in Florida with arsonist and serial killer Ottis Elwood Toole, 29, who enjoyed mutilating corpses. They met, says David Frazier in Murder Cases of the 20th Century, in a Skid Row rescue mission in Jacksonville. Although he's often been cast in Lucas's shadow, Toole had his own gruesome story, and in the end, it may be that he was in fact the more degenerate of the two of them. He was a grade school dropout with an IQ just above mentally retarded, and supposedly he'd been introduced to sex before the age of 10 by his older sister and a gay neighbor. Toole was born on March 5, 1947, in Jacksonville, Florida. Abandoned by his alcoholic father, he grew up in the custody of his mother, whom he claims dressed him as a girl, and his sister. His mother supposedly was a religious fanatic, while Toole's grandmother had been a Satanist, writes Michael Newton in the Encyclopedia of Serial Killers, and had dubbed him the Devil's Child. He'd watch her dig up graves in search of body parts to use in her rituals. Already a serial arsonist, getting erotic enjoyment out of the fires he set, and frequent runaway, he committed his first murder at age 14. A traveling salesman had picked him up for sex, and once they were in the woods, Toole ran the man over with his own car. And yet, he dressed in drag to hunt for dates at the rescue mission. Toole was suspected in 4 other murders across the country before he met Lucas in Florida. These involved shootings in Nebraska and Colorado, and 2 stabbings in Colorado. Toole had been married briefly, but his wife managed to spend only 3 days with him before she departed. In retrospect, it's no wonder. When Toole met Lucas at the soup kitchen, they went home together to have sex and soon became regular lovers. Apparently, they recognized the kindred soul in each other, so they traveled the country from 1978 until 1982. Lucas gave an interview in which he said that he had to re-educate Toole in the art of murder, which became the basis for Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Having studied prison records of how men were caught, he wanted to be certain that Toole could follow directions and avoid detection. He was doing his crimes all one way, Lucas said. I started to correct him in his ways, in doing the crime where he wouldn't leave information. They traveled together from one state to another, reportedly 26 states and DC, and their favorite prey were female hitchhikers for Lucas or males for Toole. But they also slaughtered people they robbed. Lucas indicated that he had no feelings for any of the people they picked up. He'd have a good time with them and then kill them and dump them out along the side of the road. One time, he'd even ridden across 2 states with the head of a victim in his back seat before he realized he'd kept it. During that time, Toole is mentioned in some accounts as having introduced Lucas to the Hand of Death cult, telling him how they killed children for sacrifice to Satan. Max Call describes what they did in service to this cult, supposedly learning to use rape as a tool of punishment and murder as part of the cult's overall plan. They trained people like Ottis and Henry to become killing machines. However, there was no corroboration for this story, so law enforcement dismissed it as the imagination of a loser trying to seem more special than he was. In 1977, Toole married a woman 24 years his senior and insisted that she share him with Lucas. According to interviews she later gave, he told her he couldn't perform with a woman unless he also knew he could get a man, so the following year they separated. Lucas's story is equally sordid, and it bears some odd similarities. Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in the backwoods of Virginia to a man who'd lost both legs in a train accident. Some sources say this was his stepfather, and a woman named Viola, a half-Chippewa who made a living for her small family with prostitution and bootlegging. Reportedly, she was mean when she drank. Lucas said that she'd entertain clients in front of him, his brother, and his father. Some sources indicate he had 8 siblings. He even claims, difficult as it is to believe, that when he walked out one time in disgust, his mother found him and beat him for not watching her with a client. He also said that she used to dress him up as a little girl, which humiliated him. Egger says that a half-sister claimed to have a picture of Henry with curls and wearing a dress. Psychologists who later evaluated Lucas indicated that his hatred of his mother was the source of his violent misogyny. Lucas's father reportedly dragged himself outside into the snow one day and contracted a fatal case of pneumonia. Once, when he was 5, his mother struck him in the head with a wooden board. He claimed that she knocked him out for a period of 3 days. Some sources say 1 day, others indicate 11 hours, and therefore he suffered from headaches, dizzy spells, and blackouts. He also took a knife wound to his left eye, which left him with a vulnerable area on his face that would soon hurt in an accident at school. His damaged eye was replaced with a glass eye that left him with a drooping eyelid. According to Egger, children who knew him found him sullen and antisocial. Another story Lucas told is that one of his mother's lovers got him interested in bestiality with the slain carcasses of dogs and sheep. He first killed someone, he said, just before he turned 15 in 1951. The reason he murdered this teenage girl was to see what it was like to have sex with a human, or so the story goes. Lucas certainly enjoyed the reactions his tales received, and interviewers duly wrote them down. In 1952, Lucas got in trouble with the law. On June 12, 1952, he burglarized an appliance store and was sent to a reformatory for 2 years. Upon release, he committed a felony and got 4 years at the Virginia State Penitentiary. He escaped, stole a car, and made his way to Michigan, where he was arrested and returned to prison. When he was finally done with his sentence, he went to live with his half-sister in Tecumseh, Michigan. Then his mother came for a visit. She was 74 at the time. On January 11, 1960, after drinking too much, Lucas and his mother got into an argument, supposedly over a woman Lucas wanted to marry. He grabbed a knife and plunged it into her neck. He remembered only that he knocked her a little and she had a heart attack. Lucas was convicted of second-degree murder and sent to a state prison in southern Michigan. There, he tried to commit suicide and was transferred to a forensic psychiatric hospital. For his mother's murder, he served 10 years of a 20-year sentence. But then, as soon as he was released, he got 3.5 years for trying to kidnap 2 girls. Once he was out, he moved to Pennsylvania and got married in 1975, but abandoned his wife when she accused him of molesting her daughters. That's when the one-eyed killer started to travel. In Florida, he took up with Toole, and they went cross-country together. For a while, Toole's orphaned nephew and niece, Frank and Becky Powell, came with them. Lucas had started having sex with Becky when she was only 12, while they'd been rolling around on a bed, tickling each other. She seemed willing to do anything to be with him, and he later said he grew to love her. He liked that she seemed to accept everything he said. When Toole's mother died in 1981, he started drinking and taking drugs. Around this time, on July 27th, 6-year-old Adam Walsh disappeared from a shopping mall. On August 10th, his head was found in a canal ditch in Vero Beach. Toole later claimed to be his killer, and this murder precipitated the show America's Most Wanted, hosted by Adam's father, John Walsh. The assistant police chief believed him, but then later cleared him as a suspect, and he did recant this crime. Lucas took Becky with him in 1982 because he wanted her to himself, and Toole was so angered by their betrayal that he allegedly killed 9 people in 6 different states in the course of 13 months. He was caught in Florida burning a building and was imprisoned with a 20-year sentence. He admitted to having set some 40 fires. But that did not bring back his former lover or his niece. In fact, Toole would never see Becky again. In the meantime, Lucas had wandered around Texas with his child bride, finally settling with Kate Rich. However, relatives disliked them and kicked them out, according to the American Justice documentary. They found a new home near Stoneburg in a Pentecostal commune, a former chicken ranch, known as the House of Prayer. The head of the group, Reuben Moore, was both a lay minister and a contractor. So he gave Lucas and Becky, who claimed to be husband and wife, a shack to live in, Egger says a trailer, and hired Lucas for some odd jobs. Mac's call indicates that Lucas left Florida when he did to avoid implications in the murder of a female school teacher, and he also writes that the new digs in Texas had connections to the Hand of Death cult, in which Lucas was supposedly a member. Call also described Kate Smith as a member, suggesting that she paid Lucas for activities involving organized crime. There's no reason to suppose any of that was true. According to the story Lucas told, Becky eventually tired of the living conditions and wanted to return home. On August 24, 1982, the day after Lucas's birthday, Becky argued with him, saying she missed her family. But Lucas was afraid that he'd lose her if they went back, so he resisted. He also knew he faced a warrant for stealing a truck. But Becky would not give up. She pouted and cried, so he finally relented and told her to get ready to go. Because he had no license plates on his car, he decided they should hitchhike, and they got a ride as far as Denton, Texas, north of Dallas. Lucas then got a 6-pack of beer and tried again to persuade Becky to give up the idea. She argued back, which reminded Lucas of his mother, and then Becky slapped him. He'd reacted by killing her with a meat-carving knife, shoving it straight into her chest. He was angry, he later said, that she just would not take responsibility for herself. To his horror, she died quickly. She was gone before I knew it. Then, right next to the interstate, on a blanket that Becky had spread for them to sleep, he raped the corpse. He thought it was the best sex he'd ever had with her. He then removed her head, dismembered her, removing her hands with special care, and cut the trunk of her body into 2 large pieces. The person who once had been Becky now lay there in 9 pieces. These he placed into a pillowcase, but then he removed them and just scattered them around a nearby field. He also dumped Becky's purse in a small suitcase. No one knew them around these parts, he figured, so no one could trace it. Later, he expressed regret because he claimed that he truly loved Becky. Once he cleaned off her blood, he hitched a ride back to the house of prayer and told Moore and the others that Becky had gotten into a truck and left him. Then, a couple of weeks later, he returned to the area to bury some of the remains in a shallow hole near a copse of trees. Within another week, he was contemplating another murder. It was about 3 weeks after Becky's demise, on September 16th, that things went sour with Kate Rich. Lucas went into Ringgold, where she lived, knocked on her door, and asked if she wanted to help him look for Becky, or so he told the Rangers. She agreed to go, happy to get out of the house, and Lucas stopped first for beer. On the car seat between them was a butcher's knife. Lucas clearly had something else in mind, since he knew that Becky was dead. Whether or not Kate questioned him about going north, the wrong direction, is anyone's guess. Lucas had downed a lot of beer when he said he was seized with the idea of killing Kate. He drove down a dirt road past a campground and then stopped the car. He grabbed the knife and shoved it into Kate's left side, pushing her against the door. He pulled the knife out and went around to the passenger side. When he opened the door, Kate fell onto the ground. She was dead from a wound to her heart. Lucas was immediately aroused, so he pulled the corpse down an embankment and removed the clothing. "I got naked," he told the Rangers, "and screwed her until I finished." He then dragged her to a large drainage pipe near the road. He shoved both the corpse and the clothing into it as far as he could until he felt certain no one would find her. The next day, Lucas left the house of prayer and took off, getting as far as Needles, California before the car gave out. But Lucas wasn't finished with Kate. He drifted for a month and then returned to where he'd hidden the body. He learned that he was suspected in her disappearance and endured a polygraph examination, but he got away with it. No one arrested him. Lucas retrieved the decomposing remains and put them into a stove at the house of prayer to incinerate them. After his confession, investigators went to where Lucas had indicated he'd killed Kate and found the drainage pipe, a broken pair of women's glasses, and a pair of panties. Back at the house of prayer, in the wood-burning stove, they found ashes and what looked like human bone and burnt flesh. In another area where Lucas had dumped ashes, they also found bone fragments. Lucas also showed them where he'd thrown Kate's purse, exactly the spot where it had been found months before. Officers, including Texas Rangers, then took Lucas to the Denton area to try to find Becky's remains. He went right to the copse of trees where he'd buried her and pointed to several areas on the ground. They dug at 7 different locations and found clothing, bones, a skull, and decomposing remains. The corroboration of 2 murders, both of which appeared to show experience with killing and hiding evidence, made the possibility that Lucas was telling the truth about others, even 100 others, seemed more likely now to at least some of the officers. Lucas wanted to clear his conscience entirely. So, after he was convicted of Becky's murder, he wrote Ottis Toole a 4-page letter to inform him of Becky's death and to get his assistance in recalling the details of the murders they'd committed together. He said that he hadn't yet mentioned Toole, although he had, and would leave it up to him as to whether he wanted to be involved. In fact, the Jacksonville police had already been contacted about murders in their area committed by these 2 losers. The letter went to Toole in prison. He'd heard about Lucas's confessions, and he readily backed them up, adding gruesome details of his own. Toole offered details that seemed to clear some 24 murders in 11 states, and he agreed that he'd participated with Lucas in over 100 killings. In one disturbing phone call that they were allowed to make, their first contact in 2 years, Toole urged Lucas to go ahead and spit it out if there was a crime that he'd had a hand in. Toole also tried to goad Lucas into admitting to cannibalism. In a documentary made for American Justice, he was quoted in a taped conversation as saying, "Remember that one time I said I wanted to try some ribs? Did that make me a cannibal? He indicated that they both had filleted some meat from the bodies and mentioned that he'd poured out some blood so he could see what the male victim tasted like. Lucas responded, "I've seen bodies cut up worse than you've ever seen bodies cut up." Ottis ignored this one-upmanship and indicated that with barbecue sauce, it tasted like real meat. Lucas said that he'd abstained from that behavior because he didn't like the taste of barbecue sauce. He did tell Toole that they had the devil in them that made them do these things that most people didn't. "You and I have become the same things that people look at as animals," Lucas stated, as quoted in Cox's book. After about half an hour, they said goodbye to each other, apparently having thoroughly enjoyed the repulsive show they'd put on for law enforcement. Bob Prince from the Lucas Task Force spotted the game and believed it decreased their credibility. Despite Lucas's claim to want to do the right thing, he simply took too much delight in what he was doing. Later, the partners were brought face to face when Lucas was taken to Jacksonville to talk with officers there, but said nothing of substance. Toole forgave Lucas for killing Becky, shrugging it off as her time to die. With new information supplied by Lucas, Toole received a death sentence when it was determined that one of the fires he'd set had killed a man. He received a second death sentence for the murder of an elderly woman, but both were commuted to life. After Thanksgiving in 1983, the Texas Rangers spearheaded the Henry Lee Lucas Task Force. In a one-day event sponsored by the Texas Department of Public Safety, on December 7th, Texas lawmen questioned Lucas in the hopes of closing their open cases. At the time, Lucas had taken credit for around 126 murders, and the Rangers believed that 35 were clearly associated with him. However, they were also aware that Lucas had lied about some and had said he was unclear about details of others because he'd been under the influence of alcohol or drugs. While they collected information and contacted other agencies, they filled in gaps about Lucas's whereabouts as best they could during his murdering years. Then, for 3 days in January 1984, 107 officers from 18 states and the District of Columbia filled the Holodome in Monroe, Louisiana for a second conference about the homicides allegedly killed by Henry Lee Lucas. The first one, drawing not quite as many, had been in October. At that time, it was announced that 72 cases had been cleared on Lucas and Toole, and that they were suspects in 71 more cases. He was going to be allowed to book interviews by phone or in person until his murder trial in March for the Orange Socks murder. He had 2 court-appointed attorneys looking after his rights. The Rangers urged officers not to give Lucas too many details or photographs because they wanted to be certain that cases that were cleared stayed clear. Lucas did appear to close cases and accurately lead investigators to crime scenes. He knew details about murders to which he confessed that had not been published in the press. In a case in Kennewick, Washington, he described the murder of a woman in impressive detail, and his blood was matched to blood on a towel, which he said he'd used to wipe his hand after cutting himself with the murder weapon. "I had no feelings for the people themselves or any of the crimes," he stated. "I'd pick them up hitchhiking, running, and playing, stuff like that. We'd get to going and having a good time. First thing you'd know, I'd killed her and threw her out somewhere." Finally, he faced his most serious charge. The trial for the murder of the victim, known only as Orange Socks, took place in March in San Angelo, Texas. District Attorney Ed Walsh was the chief prosecutor, while Don Higginbottom and Parker McCulloch defended Lucas. The case was to be heard before Judge John Carter, who'd recently presided over the trial of nurse Janine Jones for the murder of a child. The trial began with reports of how the victim had been murdered, including Lucas's edited confession. In a written statement and on tape, he described how he'd picked her up as a hitchhiker, had sex with her, killed her, had sex again, and dumped her in the culvert, skinning his knee on the guardrail. A videotape showed Lucas directing police officers to where he dropped the victim's body. However, the defense attorneys proved that the unedited tape revealed that Lucas sometimes contradicted himself and suffered from key lapses in memory. The sheriff even had to refresh his memory at times during the interview, which suggested that Lucas simply read the sheriff's desire for information and gave him what he wanted. The defense also used work records to show that Lucas had been in Florida on October 31st and had cashed a check on November 1st, and they tied it all up with psychiatric testimony to show that Lucas was insane. Psychologist Tom Kubizin said that Lucas had an IQ of 84, a desire to feel important, a feeling of inferiority, and a belief that he could not direct his own actions. He also had schizophrenia. Lucas cried in court when he heard all of this, forcing a recess. The prosecution hit back with evidence that suggested that Lucas's boss might have recorded his presence at work when he was not there. They also supplied psychiatric testimony that Lucas was not insane. In addition, on one of the tapes, Lucas claimed 360 murders. "We killed him almost every way there is, except poison," detailing exactly what he meant. Despite the defense's best efforts, not the least of which was a client who had proved most helpful to the other side, the jury convicted Lucas and sentenced him to die. Afterward, he seemed unfazed, even happy. It was as if he'd finally become someone of importance. Yet not everyone who'd been at the trial agreed with the verdict. It seemed that Lucas only knew key facts about the crime after the sheriff had refreshed his memory. "It was the worst confession," said Hugh Ainsworth, a reporter for the Dallas Times-Herald, who decided to do some more digging. Lucas's case occurred in the midst of an incident in Texas that provides some context for its eventual unraveling, so let's look first at that one. Roger Draper, in a lengthy 1994 article about the one-time frontier ethic of the Texas Rangers for Texas Monthly, discusses Lucas in the context of what he refers to as the infamous Brandley case. Draper states that this epitomized the wrong-headedness of the Ranger way. On August 28, 1980, Ranger Wesley Stiles investigated the assault and strangulation murder of a high school cheerleader. He arrested the custodian, Clarence Brandley, the next day without having questioned a single witness. He was quickly charged with capital murder. A jury later convicted him on nothing more than tenuous circumstantial evidence. But Stiles's tunnel vision approach was reviewed in 1989 by the Court of Criminal Appeals, and the justices found that he had ignored evidence that pointed to other suspects. He'd also threatened the state's star witness and lied on the stand. Brandley, on death row, was freed. Before that conviction was overturned and the Rangers embarrassed by one of their own, they were already going through a much more humiliating process at the hands of Lucas. Their zeal was commendable, but not their approach. One Ranger in particular bought the whole package. Max Call was one of the Texas Rangers who took over the Lucas case. Although Call's book, Hand of Death, is generally discredited since he not only befriended Lucas, but also accepted everything Lucas said at face value. Call even named Lucas as a member of the Lucas Task Force. It may nevertheless be the best account available of what Lucas actually said. Call makes it clear that Lucas was getting plenty of attention, a high-security cell, good food, and numerous trips in the company of 2 Texas Rangers. That's motivation for a man with nothing to keep making up whoppers. Henry worshipped Satan, Call writes, and believed his lies because he found justification for his fantasies in Satan's service. Call believed that Lucas had joined Toole in the so-called Hand of Death cult in the Florida Everglades, and he thought that by writing the book, he would be warning people about this dangerous organization. He seemed to genuinely believe that Henry Lee Lucas assisted in 360 rapes and murders at the behest of the Hand of Death, which supposedly had links to organized crime and practiced the sacrifice of females. In fact, Lucas indicated that they'd recruited and trained him specifically to become a killing machine, and he was able to describe just how these supposed sacrifices worked. Call's gullibility is obvious when he says that Lucas wanted to confess as a way of exposing the cult, and it's likely that Lucas keyed into Call's own religious beliefs to hook him and play him. The book is replete with religious ideology, especially when it seems that Becky's found the way out through the Bible. Call seems to like this moral angle, playing it up whenever he can. In addition, he accepts whatever Lucas tells him. For example, Lucas apparently described Toole as a nice-looking young man, when in fact Toole is closer to winning the contest for homeliest serial killer. Unfortunately, most of Call's chapter about Lucas's childhood experience with his mother was clearly uncorroborated, and there's no way of knowing how much is factual. Lucas was angry at his mother, and he likely skewed the story to make her look as evil as possible. Other authors have picked up on this account, including psychologists and criminologists. So it's important to reiterate that there's little in Lucas's account of his childhood that bears the stamp of corroborated fact. Anything that Call writes about must be viewed with some skepticism, especially since he recreates it as a story with dialogue and incidents he never witnessed. As Lucas's death toll climbed to some 600 victims in 27 different states and in Canada, according to some accounts, though others cap it at 360, it began to seem as if he was just a compulsive confessor. He'd added in the satanic cult activity, which at the time seemed to justify his numbers, but it only made some people suspicious that it was all a hoax. Cox describes how reporter Hugh Ainsworth, co-writer with Stephen Michaud on a book about Ted Bundy, sat through Lucas's trial and had his doubts. He did some sleuthing and found that Lucas had been out of state or in prison at times when some of the murders to which he'd confessed had occurred. That inspired McLennan County DA Vic Fiesel to look into Lucas's confessions to 2 murders in his own area. Apparently, Lucas had written a letter to a reporter in Fort Worth suggesting that he was not actually responsible for all the murders he'd claimed, and that the parents of one of Lucas's supposed victims decided after reviewing his statement that he was not the killer of their daughter. Ainsworth had interviewed Lucas himself and wrote a lengthy piece that was published on April 14, 1984. He asked the important question, was it all a hoax? He believed it was, and accused the task force of failing to follow leads that may have undermined Lucas's credibility, such as noting the distance between crime scenes that made it virtually impossible for Lucas to have committed some murders that were close together in time. He thought the information about many of the murders had been fed to Lucas in order to close the cases. Supposedly, Lucas had finally admitted that he was good for only 3 murders in his life: his mother, Becky, and Kate. But Lucas told a lay sister, who then told other reporters, that he'd lied to Ainsworth and was in fact the monstrous killer he'd claimed. His newfound religion forced him to tell the truth, but Lucas told a lay sister, who then told other reporters. Officers involved insisted that they did not believe everything Lucas said, but when he knew key unpublished details and could lead them directly to a crime scene, that was convincing evidence. He certainly had killed far more than 3. In fact, by that point, writes Cox, 189 murders had been cleared and attributed to him. On April 23rd, he said that the only person he'd ever killed was his mother, and that had been an accident. He'd been able to clear so many murders because the Rangers had given him everything he needed to do so: pictures, reports, and even leading him to the crime scenes. He got a live appearance on Good Morning America to repeat his allegations. His decision to recant, he said, was based on his belief in God, the same reason he'd earlier given to confess to so many murders. This news was just as stunning as his initial confession, and the officers involved quickly mobilized to try to piece together some dignity. Apparently, Lucas enjoyed shocking law enforcement with numbers, perverse activities, and gruesome details. Nevertheless, he did point to places where victims were found, and now it's estimated by some that he was responsible for some 40 to 50 murders. On the other hand, those who make this estimation may also be saving face, not willing to admit that they may have fed him information. Ryan reports the manner in which Lucas typically confessed to a number of unsolved murders. If a police agency suspected Lucas, and if Lucas admitted involvement, and his total of some 3,000 confessions suggest he rarely denied complicity, they would send the Lucas Task Force a case file with information pertaining to the unsolved crime. Lucas would be questioned at length and sometimes even allowed to read police reports, thus learning any number of details previously known only to police, which he could then regurgitate at will. The Rangers insisted that Lucas was a serial killer, and they were reportedly annoyed with Fiesel for interfering. They claimed that they'd taken much more care in keeping details from Lucas than they were being accused of. Yet Draper says that one ranger told the DA, "I'm going to make you regret this if it's the last thing I do." But the damage had been done. The media had picked up on this hoax, which was nearly too good to be true, and Lucas's status changed from one of the world's most notorious killers to one of the world's most notorious liars. No matter what he said now, no one would believe it. This made all those in law enforcement who had rushed to interview him and who had closed cases look rather lame. Several retired rangers later said that it was their impression during the interrogations that Lucas was a liar. Still, it was difficult for them to accept that in cases where Lucas led them to the right spot where a body had lain, he had nothing to do with it. He simply knew too much about certain crimes on his own, without assistance. Then, on April 29th, Lucas returned to some of his original statements. He gave an interview to a radio show personality indicating that, "I have killed the people I said I killed." He again put the figure at 360. Then he said that everything was a lie and indicated that the Hands of Death cult was going to assassinate him. No one knew quite what to make of a killer confessing to so many crimes he did not do, but then he insisted that he'd been forced to recant. His persistent waffling further reduced his credibility. Police are familiar with several types of false confessions, including from people who confess spontaneously to something they did not do. That's usually in response to a high-profile case in the hope of becoming famous. Sometimes it's about misplaced guilt, where the confessor believes he should be punished for something, anything. There are also coerced confessions, usually offered when the person under interrogation is exhausted, naive, frightened, or mentally impaired. Some people fear that the interrogation will be stressful, so they capitulate quickly. But on rare occasions, a person may internalize the events and actually believe he or she did it. That occurs when an interrogator seems confident of the suspect's guilt and may even lie or use manipulative tactics. The characteristics of those most likely to falsely confess include youth, a low IQ, mental illness or confusion, a high degree of suggestibility, a trusting nature, low self-esteem, high anxiety, and a poor memory. But the person seeking to attach himself to a specific case seems closest to what Lucas did. In Texas Monthly, Draper indicates that the Rangers had been overeager in their desire to close open cases, so they provided Lucas with some of the details he needed to confess. They called it helping to refresh his memory, and he fully exploited it for his own ends. He had nothing whatsoever to lose, but plenty to gain by way of entertainment and feeling empowered. In fact, Lucas confessed to a murder in Little Rock, Arkansas that had already been solved, which made a DA there suspicious of his admissions. The same thing happened with West Virginia officials when Lucas claimed credit for killing a police officer whose death was determined to have been a suicide. In another Arkansas case, Lucas could not offer details until after state police had shown him a crime scene video that they'd made. It was easy then for him to give them whatever they needed to tie him to that murder. He also confessed to a killing in Delaware in which there was already a suspect in custody. That suspect eventually confessed as well. "I set out to break and corrupt any law enforcement officer I could get," Lucas said. "I think I did a pretty good job." Through dubious methods, says Draper, the Rangers extracted literally hundreds of confessions from Henry Lee Lucas. Perhaps Lucas was living by the principle that Edgar attributes to him. If rules befitted him, he went along. If they didn't, he broke them. In other words, he cleaved to whatever he thought was in his best interest at the moment. On June 11, 1984, further investigations of open cases were halted, while many of the cleared cases had already been reopened. Lucas was transferred to the state prison at Huntsville, claiming that his rights prior to the trial for Orange Socks had been violated. Somehow, he believed that by undermining law enforcement as he'd done, he'd regain his freedom. He told one officer he'd be free in a month. In 1991, Ottis Toole received 4 more life sentences for the murders of 3 women and a man in Florida between 1980 and 1981. Lucas was charged along with them, but not brought to Florida for prosecution. 5 years later, in 1996, Toole died in prison from cirrhosis of the liver. Before that happened, a curious incident involved his former partner, Lucas. Many serial killers attract groupies, and while Lucas was not among the best-looking men, he was certainly notorious and had his share of admirers. One woman, Phyllis Wilcox, even came up with a plot to free him by posing as his supposedly murdered former girlfriend. Ryan McMichael includes an interview with her on his website, given after she wrote to him in 2000 when he posted an online blog about Lucas. According to this story, in October 1992, Wilcox posed as Becky, all grown up, although some 15 years older than Becky would have been at the time, claiming that she was still alive so that she could get him out of that murder rap. She was actually a mother and grandmother, age 40, and living in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. She met Lucas via correspondence after reading a book about him, and she soon visited. She indicates that although she was nervous about going into prison and quite intimidated by the sight of Lucas in handcuffs surrounded by guards, she had a wonderful time and made many more visits thereafter. Among the subjects they discussed was Becky Powell. Lucas apparently claimed that he'd seen Becky get into a truck, but he told authorities that he'd killed her so they wouldn't attempt to implicate her in the murders that he'd committed. In other words, she says, he told Wilcox that Becky was still alive. Lucas also denied killing Kate Rich in orange socks, indicating that the oven in which he supposedly had burned Kate was too small for a woman as fat as she was and would not have gotten hot enough to have burned her to ash. He was sure that the authorities found some chicken bones, nothing more, and exaggerated their significance. About orange socks, he claimed that the bruises around her neck did not even fit his hands, but he did admit that he'd murdered his mother. Wilcox bought it all and confessed to McMichael that despite being married, she soon became obsessed with Lucas, thinking and dreaming about him all the time. She knew she was falling in love. He accepted her feelings and told her he loved her too. It wasn't long before Wilcox grew afraid that Lucas might be executed, so she devised a plan to make sure that didn't happen. She believed that he was innocent of the charges. She'd even come up with a way to exonerate him in her mind of killing his mother by blaming someone else. So she posed as Becky and Lucas backed her up. He said that he'd only confessed to murdering Becky because he wanted to embarrass the police. He seems to have forgotten that they actually picked up Becky's remains as Lucas showed them where each piece was. They didn't get away with it. Fraser indicates that Wilcox was revealed, when this hoax was unraveled, as a diagnosed schizophrenic who had also corresponded with John Wayne Gacy and Charles Manson. But Lucas was still determined to beat his death sentence. While it was clear that Lucas had committed 4 murders, including his mother, even one of those, orange socks, eventually came under doubt. The only thing linking Lucas to orange socks was essentially his confession. In fact, some 213 cases had been cleared through Lucas's confessions, which concerned the writers of the Lucas Report, a document commissioned by the Texas Attorney General's office. Ultimately, Lucas was convicted of only 11 homicides, says Egger, though some criminologists believe he was responsible for between 40 to 50 murders. Still, no one knows for sure. The death sentence for the murder of Orange Socks stood for many years, although Lucas received 2 stays of execution because the evidence was too slim. Apparently, it was now the case that the work records that had been discredited at the trial were now considered viable evidence on Lucas's behalf. That's because a lot more research has been done. Former Attorney General's investigator Michael Fury had developed a thick file about Lucas's whereabouts on the night that Orange Socks had been murdered. The documentation made it clear that he was indeed in Jacksonville, Florida. Fury had utilized records such as paycheck stubs and insurance reports to track Lucas as he drifted around the Southeast. He was ready to submit all of this on Lucas's behalf, and it was entered into evidence when Lucas received a hearing in 1996 about his death sentence. Lucas took the witness stand, writes Gene Pagel for the Associated Press, to say that he did not kill the woman known as Orange Socks. He cried and for about 15 minutes spoke in a trembling voice before U.S. District Judge Sam R. Cummings. Lucas said that he'd given false information when he'd confessed to the murder, and added that he was able to give a lot of facts about the crime because he'd read the case file. In fact, he had an alibi. He was in Florida putting out a car fire. The Assistant Texas Attorney General, Gina Blount, took him to task for playing games with investigators, and Lucas denied that it had been a game. "I had my reasons," he responded. He received a stay, and 2 years later, the matter went to the governor. In 1998, based on the lack of evidence connecting Lucas to the murder and the existence of contradictory evidence, then Texas Governor George W. Bush commuted Lucas's sentence to life, the only man to receive this during Bush's reign. 7 years later, in 2005, in the New York Review of Books, Sister Helen Prejean, author of Dead Man Walking, wrote about Bush's decision. She suggested that he'd been motivated more by expediency than conscience, and offered the relevant supporting facts. During his 6 years as governor of Texas, Bush had presided over 152 executions, more than any other governor in any other state in recent history. He'd commuted no other death sentences to life, although there were factors as significant as any that Lucas's attorneys offered. Journalist Alan Berlow apparently discovered that Bush's examination of at least 57 of these cases involved only cursory reviews of brief death penalty memos on the day before the scheduled execution. In one case, Bush had skipped over evidence that the convicted man was mentally retarded and therefore not even eligible for the death penalty. Prejean calls the Texas Board of Pardons and Appeals a farce that Bush did nothing to reform. Then she writes about Lucas. In the Henry Lee Lucas case in 1998, Bush showed where the real power lay. He intervened with the board before they had a chance to make a recommendation, and afterward, the board approved his decision in a 17-1 vote. Prejean points out that it was common knowledge by then that Lucas could not have murdered the woman known as Orange Socks. Additionally, she writes, it was clear that Lucas would never be a threat to society because he was already serving 6 life sentences for other murders, which he may or may not have committed, since on a fairly regular basis he confessed falsely to hundreds of murders. Bush pointed out that jurors at his trial did not know certain facts that later came to light. Thus, he took the opportunity, she claims, to exercise apparent compassion, although in the context of his actual record, his compassion diminishes into mere politics. No one knows exactly how many murders Henry Lee Lucas and Ottis Toole committed. Given Lucas's trickster methods and propensity to lie, it's likely that no one will ever know, beyond his mother, Kate Rich, and Becky Powell. There seems to be good evidence that he killed others, but judges would not admit his confessions, so it was difficult to bring the cases to trial. In March 2001, Henry Lee Lucas died in prison of natural causes. Thus ended one of the most unusual cases in the annals of criminal psychology.
Hey there, amazing true crime enthusiasts. I've got some thrilling news to share with all of you. If you've been following my YouTube channel, you already know we've been delving deep into the world of true crime mysteries together. It's been an incredible journey, and I'm so grateful for your support. But guess what? We're taking things to the next level. I'm excited to announce that I've just launched a brand new podcast on Spotify where you can enjoy the audio versions of all your favorite YouTube videos, minus the intros, outros, and ads. It's like getting to the heart of the true crime stories you love, delivered straight to your ears. The podcast is on Spotify right now, so hit that follow button to make sure you never miss an episode. This podcast is all about bringing you the core content of our true crime investigations in a convenient audio format. So whether you're on your daily commute, going for a run, or just chilling at home, you can now immerse yourself in these captivating stories without any distractions. If you have any cases you'd like me to cover, or if you just want to chat about true crime, feel free to drop me a message on social media or leave a comment. Your input and engagement mean the world to me. Thank you for being such an amazing community and for joining me on this journey. I'm thrilled to make these stories more accessible to you through our new podcast on Spotify. So grab your headphones and hit that follow button. Stay curious, my friends. Talk to you soon. And as always, stay safe and take care.